and final in the series, Public Finance Debates of 2013. These debates are organized jointly by the Chair of Public Finance, Victoria University of Wellington, and the Government Economics Network, which we refer to as GEN. My name is Girol Karacaoğlu. I'm today here as the chairperson of GEN. So welcome all. This is the third debate of the year, and the first one, the proposition was, it's time to tax the internet. The second one we've had was, it's time New Zealand extended charging for public infrastructure. And today's debate, the proposition is, it's time New Zealand adopted a social insurance approach to welfare. The first point I want to make on the administrative side is to note, as you see on the board, that there has actually been a change in the speaker lineout, because the proponent was supposed to be Professor Rima Vainitianathan. Unfortunately, she called in sick, and thankfully the highly agile Alison O'Connell, who has a fantastic agile brain, was able to switch and fill in for the role of proponent. And Norman Gemmell, who has been thinking about risk management for a long time, was able to then become a commentator. But John Gibson is so vehemently sort of wanting to go for the opponent's role that he didn't want to budge. So he's still here, and we're delighted about that. In terms of housekeeping, the video cameras run during these presentations, but then they get turned off during Q&A time. Emergency evacuation and so on, those details have been on the slides for a while, so hopefully you're all familiar with it. You've memorized it all. The final point here is, if you could please turn off your mobile phones, that would be fantastic. Just a bit of background on these public finance debates for people who have not been present before, for newcomers. We take the attitude that reasonable people can take a strong position for either side of these issues. These positions can reflect different ideology or value judgments or views on the so-called facts of the case. We will focus on the key arguments and evidence for and against a particular view or choice. To assist the process, we have invited, as always, a proponent, an opponent, to present each case as strongly as possible, regardless of their personal views. So this doesn't necessarily reflect their personal views. Then we'll have a commentator who will help open the debate up for general discussion by highlighting the main strengths and weaknesses of the alternative views and trying to look for a middle ground. It's like a courtroom analogy. We have a case for defense, a prosecution, and then summing up for you, the jury. And it is Chatham House rules, so you can repeat the comments here but not attribute them to the individuals. And regarding presenters, you must consult with them before reporting their words. Each presenter takes 20 minutes and 10 minutes for the commentator. At the end of the allocated time, a bell will ring briefly when you have 2 minutes left. When you get to the limit, then it will ring persistently, rudely, until the person stops talking. Then we'll have 30 minutes of discussion, which I will chair. And at the end of which, and this is new, usually we had one vote. Today we have 2 votes. One, which speaker presented the most convincing case? And the second one will be, do you support the proposition? And then following that, we'll have some drinks and food in the foyer. Should you wish to stay, we hope you can, to just chat to each other and enjoy some hospitality as well. So let me just briefly introduce the debate. As I said, what we are debating today is the proposition that it's time New Zealand adopted a social insurance approach to welfare. Several countries provide state-funded working-age welfare and retirement income from specific earnings-related contributions or taxes, rather than funded out of general tax revenues. These contributions are usually required from employers and employees, and payments under the schemes are usually related to the contribution paid in, though this link can be loose, as in the UK, or stronger, as in the Netherlands. New Zealand generally funds working age welfare like pensions from general tax revenues. Yet it funds accident insurance from a general system of ACC contributions levied on individuals and employers. And some retirement income is now also funded via KiwiSaver based on contributions to individuals' retirement accounts. So should New Zealand apply either of these approaches more widely to fund working age welfare such as unemployment or family welfare benefits? Today's debaters will hammer this one out. In terms of debaters and their backgrounds, Dr. Alison O'Connell is the proponent today. Alison is a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and a policy advisor on longevity, pensions and risk issues. She is a board member of the Earthquake Commission of New Zealand and has recently been a panel member of the long-term fiscal process for the New Zealand Treasury. Alison was the founding director and is now a governor of the UK's Pensions Policy Institute, which provides non-political, evidence-based analysis on retirement income policy. Her research interests include international public and private pension policy structures and outcomes, the use of mortality and longevity forecasting policy, and the aging society. John Gibson, Professor John Gibson, is the opponent. John is Professor of Economics at Waikato Management School, a graduate of Lincoln University. John has a doctorate from Stanford University in the US. His teaching and research interests are in microeconomics and in the microeconometric aspects of development, labor, and the international economy. John is currently a senior research associate at the Motu Economic and Public Policy Research Trust. His other research interests include poverty measurement, where he's a member of an expert group advising the United Nations Statistical Division, the design and analysis of household survey data and economic development, especially in China and other Asian and Pacific economies. And finally, Professor Norman Gemmell, who is going to be the commentator today, is the chair in public finance at Victoria University, and the chair is a co-sponsor of these public finance debates with the Government Economics Network. Norman was previously the chief economist and principal advisor of tax at the New Zealand Treasury and an assistant director of the UK Inland Revenue's Analysis and Research Department. Norman gained his BA, Honours Economics and PhD in Economics from the University of Durham, UK, and has held economic positions at the University of Durham, Australian National University, and the University of Nottingham. Norman's research interests cover a range of topics across economics and political economy, but mainly in the areas of public finance, taxation, public expenditure and public debt, and economic growth. So again, welcome all. And now I invite Alison to talk to us as the proponent of the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Gero. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's time New Zealand adopted a social insurance approach to welfare. First of all, what's special about this time? Well, you just need to take a glance at the long-term fiscal statement, although I hope most of you have had more than a glance, to know that we're living in a time of an ageing population. And there are risks that we know are going to increase in future: health risks, longevity risks, and long-term care risks. I'm taking a broad approach to welfare, but bear with me. Given those increasing costs, anywhere in which we can look for broadening the tax base, getting new streams of income to help pay for those costs would be welcome, rather than relentlessly always think about cutting costs or having to make do. So it's time. Secondly, social insurance. Social insurance is a programme where risks are transferred to and pooled by a government organisation that's legally required to provide certain benefits. So here are the key features of a social insurance programme. There are many different types and variations in details, but broadly, social insurance is government-sponsored, government-organised, which means that even though the private sector may take a very strong role in lots of different ways, the parameters are defined by statute, the benefits, the eligibility criteria, that kind of thing. And it's that statute or legislation defining the benefits that gives some comfort that there are rights which can't easily be taken away. Secondly, social insurance provides some risk pooling. So for those risks that don't fall equally on the population, there's some help if you can't bear the costs of it all on your own. And thirdly, it's about having taxes or premiums, we're going to call them contributions, paid by or on behalf of a defined population. So contributions paid by a defined population, but some others might be credited into the system if they can't pay. The key here is separate contributions, separate from general taxation, different from income tax. And that defined population is usually, well, it's either compulsory that they're members, or that the system is so heavily incentivized or so obviously a good thing that most people would choose to join voluntarily. Now often, as Gemmell mentioned, contributions are paid only by employers and people in paid work, but still the scheme is separate from separate from general taxation, and there's explicit accounting to keep it separate. That might go so far as just accounting separately for income and expenses, but it might go further. There might actually be a trust, a board looking after the money, or a board as some trustees. There might actually be a separate fund that is invested separately. There are all sorts of different models. But that extra separation and layer of oversight that comes from explicit accounting is another degree of comfort that members can have for that their rights will be honoured and difficult to take away. It gives some extra transparency into a scheme that isn't often there with general taxation. Now this last point is really crucial. The separation from tax is fundamental to the contributory principle of social insurance. Beveridge, Sir William Beveridge, back in the day, defined the contributory principle when he said, "In their capacity as possible recipients of a benefit, the poorer man and the richer man are treated alike." Now, a lot's happened since Beveridge's day. Women, for example, exist now. And the contributory system and what we mean by it has evolved. But it's still a very important concept that making a contribution makes you a member of something that gives you some kind of right to a benefit, which makes it different, for example, from benefits which are means tested. Makes it different from benefits which are universally available, perhaps just because you're a resident or for some other criteria. So it's this membership ideal. Now, New Zealand already has a couple of examples of this. ACC. If you're injured, there's a long benefit payment period for some of those injuries. You're a member of the ACC fund. EQC. Now, EQC might call itself a disaster compensation scheme that is only run partially on insurance principles, but still, given these points on the screen, it certainly lives up to those. So yes, EQC and ACC are examples of a type of social insurance that is separate from general taxation. Both have boards that give that extra level of oversight and transparency. And in both these examples, a completely private market insurance solution we know has problems because that's been rejected for New Zealand. So the need for some kind of organisation by government is broadly understood. Although, of course, we can argue forever about the exact role of government and the exact parameters we use when we're defining the role of government. So is welfare a contender for social insurance? Well, I think really all of us would say that government would have some role in organising welfare, even though we might disagree on the details. So I'm going to tick off that first bullet point and say yes, welfare is something that should be government-sponsored or government-organised. Secondly, what about risk pooling? Are there risks that are severe enough and difficult enough for the private market to cover that mean that welfare should be in some way risk pooled by government? Again, I think the answer is yes. If you think about pensions, nearly everyone will live to be age 65. That's no longer very much an insurable risk. But it's thereafter there's the longevity risk. Many people will live for 30 years after that, and many people don't understand the distribution that comes with that probability of longevity. And not everyone will be able to provide for themselves for even a basic income over their lifetime because of stops and starts or low levels of earnings during their working lifetime. So welfare provides a basic income protected against longevity. Unemployment. The average New Zealand worker has more than a 1 in 10 chance of being unemployed in any year. sickness, long-term disability. Clearly, these are risks that don't fall equally. Any one of us could fall prey to them. And long-term care. Long-term care is an asymmetric risk. 1/4 of us may need none or very little care, but for 1 in 10 of us, we will need so much care that the costs in insurance terms will be catastrophic. So yes, these are risks that strike some and not others. And social insurance is used to cover these and other risks overseas. There are various different types of social insurance schemes. The continental, more Bismarckian model takes different forms, but usually it's in the form of different mutual funds. So, for example, just to take the area of health, France has 3 main mutual funds that cover most of the population for health risks. In the Netherlands, it's 20 or so. If you go to Germany, there are more than 200 funds. But the point is, this is social insurance, even though it's broken up in a different way. In the US, the Social Security fund there is enormous. Its annual income is $840 billion US dollars. And that's to cover the welfare risks of pensions, disability, and bereavement benefits, in other words, death of your spouse. In the UK, the National Insurance Fund is also an extremely substantial fund where the income is £100 billion a year, and that compares with income tax of £150 billion a year. So national insurance in the UK is extremely substantial and again covers a range of welfare benefits. It covers pensions, unemployment, sickness, disability, and bereavement again. So all these risks, they're risks that strike some and not others. They don't strike equally. And we accept the idea of risk pooling because our ideas of social justice carry us so far as to say that people should not be left to deal with those problems on their own. Now, that gives a tick, I think, to welfare under the risk pooling bullet point. Now, clearly it's possible for the government to do this, as it does in New Zealand largely to some extent, to be for general taxation to be the organising system to cover welfare risks. So the crux of today's debate lies in the third dot point there. Should there be a system where contributions to cover welfare are separate from taxation? It can take many different ways of doing so, like ACC, like EQC, very specific, or on a broader scale, like some of the overseas examples I've mentioned. But the motion before us today does not require us to accept or reject a specific proposal. It asks us only to accept that it's time social insurance of some kind be considered for welfare in New Zealand. So I think we ought to get underneath a little more what welfare actually is. And to do this, I've tapped the brain of one of the world's foremost experts in welfare, Professor John Hills of the London School of Economics. He describes welfare like this. The majority of what the welfare state as a whole does is in fact a kind of redistribution across people's life cycles, rather than between people on a lifetime basis. So it's not just simply redistribution from rich to the poor, it's much more than that. And he goes on to quote Richard Titmuss, who back in the 50s described the public finances as being like Crewe Junction, with traffic, welfare transfers, in many directions, rather than like a simple terminus with just one-way, one-dimensional flows from rich to poor. Now, I'm well aware that the notion of a railway junction doesn't quite work in New Zealand, right? There isn't one here, is there? You get to Britomart, or you get to the railway station and you stop. But this is an audience of some calibre, and you all understand the notion, don't you, of a welfare state as a railway junction with lots of different money flowing in different directions. And you don't know whether you go to the junction and then you have to take another train because you're on a different journey to you expected, because you've fallen sick, because you've become disabled, because you've become unemployed. Or whether or not you just go to the terminus, you have a quick cup of coffee, a quick break as you're unemployed, and then go back to your life perfectly happy, having only dipped into the welfare state very temporarily. So you've got the metaphor, right? I don't need to labour that one. But the point is, and the point John Hills is making, is that a pooled social insurance system conveys this idea of lots of different types of transfers going in different directions over time, without necessarily being too precise about the contributions going in and how they're linked to the benefits coming out. So he goes on to say, there is much to be said for a system that conveys this idea. Given the imperfection of national insurance as true social insurance, this is close to saying that the system is a myth, but a useful myth for the population to believe in. Now, that takes a bit of undoing. What he's saying here is that the UK national insurance system works because the public understands something valuable by the type of pooling in social insurance, even though the actual system in front of them is an imperfect model of social insurance. Now, the system is imperfect in the sense that national insurance is not the true social insurance model that Beveridge originally intended, or that rationalists might put up on a slide of what the key features of social insurance should be. The fund, well, the fund doesn't actually really exist at all, to be honest, and it's not ring-fenced as he wanted. The contributions are not linked to benefits in a transparent way. Non-contributory benefits and means testing have grown to be significant and intertwined with those contributory benefits. The richer person now pays more than the poorer person, and the benefits are scaled as well. In other words, national insurance collects contributions separately from tax, but it actually works quite like taxation. It's not true social insurance, but even so, it's still useful and it's still valued. And Professor Hills is an advocate for reform of social insurance and retention of that system, rather than discarding it. So it's very useful, social insurance, because it gives governments another stream of income. But it's also useful because there is true support from opinion leaders and from people in the street. Now, I'm sure my opponent is going to give a very erudite and intellectual list of all the theoretical reasons why social insurance is not a good thing or doesn't work, or rationally it's just the same as taxation, so why should we bother? And that's fine. Similarly, I can give a list of all the reasons why intellectually it's a very good thing, and so on. But the point is, there's something about social insurance that gets beyond that, that perhaps appeals to the heart rather than the head. And this is not to be dismissed lightly. When I was working at the PPI, I did my team and I did a research paper which investigated the reasons why people were so strongly attached to the contributory principle. And we found a lot of surprising things. We got all the list of technical rational details. But even people who were very, very intellectual would say that they wanted to retain it. So here's a couple of quotes from both sides of the political spectrum. The first comes from the Conservative, so right, quite right, spokesman for Work and Pensions, who's now a minister on the right Conservative side of the coalition government. Now, he's so intellectual that his nickname is actually Two Brains. And yet, he could go through all the rational reasons, but what he came up with in the end, well, maybe it's just because I'm a Conservative that I'm inclined towards reforming the contributory principle rather than abolishing it. But from completely the other side of the political divide, the Trades Union Congress had an interesting way of putting it. Most people want to see a bit of redistribution, but they also want to see themselves as having some rights as well. And in a rough and ready way, national insurance, social insurance, appeals to basic beliefs about social justice. So we shouldn't dismiss these strongly held values lightly, especially if we need to get some more income into the system, she says cynically. Even watered down, social insurance schemes can give a more definite expression of rights and social justice than taxation alone can do. Now, because rationalists in the UK understand that it's a myth, they're saying it's really obsolete and it should be merged into income tax. So while we're here debating whether or not to bring in more social insurance for New Zealand, in the UK they've been discussing for over a decade whether to discard theirs. Their debate has been prolonged and painful for reasons such as this. But where they seem to be ending up is that they're going to go through as much operational merging as they can to minimise the costs of collecting those separate contributions as they can, but still keep this separate system, simply because the value of it is too strong to dissipate. Now, we don't have the problems of trying to change a system which is in place. We can start something from scratch and design it to be both low cost and valuable, and with all the good things that we would say about social insurance, about transparency and benefits as of right and so on, and without any of the bad things which my opponent is going to raise. So I think that in thinking whether New Zealand should introduce a new social insurance system for welfare, we should ask ourselves, could there be value, even mythical, from introducing a new separate system? And can it be done at acceptable cost? I think the answer to both those questions can be yes. The questions have to be debated and answered in the context of where New Zealand is today, based on New Zealand's starting point, culture, traditions and institutional structures. But I believe the answer is yes, given both our enduring commitment to fairness, which social insurance embodies, and our proven ability to design innovative insurance-based schemes. Now, my contender would be to keep it specific, annuities for longevity insurance or some other solution for that. Long-term care is something that perhaps we haven't thought about as strongly as we might. But I would say, yes, it's time that New Zealand adopts a social insurance approach to welfare, and I propose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was fantastic. You appealed to both the brain and the heart. It's fantastic. Let's see whether John can beat that. So, John, please, you're the opponent. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be an opponent. Wreckers and breakers. I forgot what the previous Prime Minister's comment once were of people who found it naturally easier to oppose. It's not time for New Zealand to adopt a social insurance approach to welfare, and indeed it may never be time. I'm glad that Alison mentioned the word mythical, because often social insurance schemes involve creating mythical entities. What do I mean by that? Like many people in this room, I've spent quite a lot of time in the United States, and I have a US Social Security number. I can remember my number. And when FDR and the New Deal Democrats set up the Social Security Administration, people were given individual accounts so that ostensibly someone could telephone up and say, how's my individual account going? Well, of course, it's entirely mythical, because there were no such individual accounts. It simply was taking money in the aggregate. There is a trust fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, which again is insolvent and is taking money from other sources of revenue. And so the problem with these apparent social insurances is that typically they ultimately rely on other forms of public finance because of fungibility. Money is fungible. Governments find needs that are required, and so they tie our hands without necessarily doing anything to benefit us, except for particular people who are easily swayed by mythical entities such as individual accounts and so forth. So let me go back a little bit, because most of the time, and I was expecting Rima, who also would often describe herself as a development economist. Most of the time I work in poor countries rather than New Zealand, although wait long enough, and as Grant Scobie pointed out on a paper on banana republic status many years ago, maybe it would be better to be banana republics. In poor countries, we see many people who try and manage risk. Right? Risk is a fundamental part of life. But they don't have access to either contributory social schemes or to national entitlement schemes. They try to do it by themselves, with their clan, with their village, and so on and so forth. And they miss the advantages of pooling risk over space, of pooling risk over time, but also of pooling risk intergenerationally, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And so they use all sorts of innovative techniques which have been grist to the mill for development economists. Bullocks, accumulate wealth through bullocks. The problem is that when you're trying to sell your bullock because along comes a shock, typically your neighbour is selling their bullock, and so the price of bullocks is extremely low. They diversify by sending their daughters to areas of India which have apparently negative covariation with your own income so that they will receive remittances. In Papua New Guinea, where I work a lot, they have trading networks with people who live about 600 metres lower elevation because the main risk for those people is climate, frost and drought in the highlands. And so All of these solutions have been attempted, but typically they're extremely costly at the individual level. We see people giving up through lower productivity, through being part of very complicated social arrangements, typically in the order of 1/5 of their income in order to insure, which is much more than most people in rich countries do. And when we move forward to rich countries, and we've seen this already in New Zealand in the case of Christchurch, people who are short-sighted, in my old version of the notes, not knowing it was Chatham House, I'd actually said foolish, people who are short-sighted and underinsured are likely to get bailed out anyway. And indeed, not only is that going to be the case for individuals, but we know that is often the case for funds. And as a result, the apparent advantages of a contributory scheme are going to disappear. It's worth seeing some pictures. It's late in the day. And so here's our friend Otto von Bismarck, and Alison mentioned, the sort of two extremes, and I'll go to the extremes as one can go. Statutory health insurance in 1883, right? Contributions financed from payroll tax, the insured are gainfully engaged, and typically, and Alison stressed this, there are some notion that your benefits depend somewhat on your contributions, and so there are senses of entitlement at the individual level, and these can be extremely difficult to reform, as we've seen in many entitlement-based schemes. Jump forward to what we would think of as the next extreme, universal entitlement systems, and most closely associated with beverage. While these typically involve a generational social contract, and as again we've seen with John Key's pledge to resign before the age of retirement, of the age of superannuation eligibility in New Zealand changes, these generational promises can also be difficult to reform, but not in the same way that individual entitlements can be. Okay? These give us the possibility to redistribute in ways which pure Bismarckian systems do not. These give us the chance to redistribute between generations, whereas a pure Bismarckian system is essentially a closed system. What are the two problems that any form of insurance face, whether contributory or individualized or social? Covariate risk, right? We can insure easily against idiosyncratic shocks. Rima got sick. That didn't affect the entire economics department at Auckland University of Technology. It's a lot harder for us to insure against covariate shocks, as Alison can attest, living in Sumner and Christchurch and working for EQC. But in addition to these sort of covariate risks over space, we also have generational shocks. And what we know, at least since Samuelson, is that with a pay-as-you-go entitlement system, it is possible for every generation to get out more than it put in if the rate of productivity or economic growth is sufficiently large. And we might have some generations who happen to have been lucky enough to be born in a time of great technological advance. Alison mentioned life expectancy. NIDI, the demographic institution in the Netherlands, has now forecast that females born in the year 2000, 50% of them will reach the year 2001. So life expectancy for females now, median life expectancy is indeed 100 years. This is a wonderful thing compared with generations who were born in the Second World War, in times of famine. And so we have a sense, even though I've forgotten the chap's name who wrote Selfish Generations, it's a nice catchy idea that generations should in some sense be self-contained, but indeed some generations are better able to provide for other generations. And so when we have pure contributory-based schemes that are enclosed, we lose that possibility of generational cross-subsidization. Okay? So that's one, the covariate risk. The next problem is asymmetric information, and two forms of this, adverse selection and moral hazard. And our friend Barack Obama is learning a lot about adverse selection now, if he didn't already. Let me repeat the promise, which he made many times, which is getting him into trouble. If you like your current plan, you will be able to keep it. Let me repeat, if you like your plan, you will be able to keep it. Now, what's the problem which is occurring in the US with Obamacare right now? Well, poor, uninsured people, in order to bring them into the net, it's going to require some cross-subsidization for other people who otherwise would rather not, because we need to risk pool across the widest possible group. Now, who would rather not insure? Young, healthy people. Young, healthy people pay the $95 fine or on their taxes, which is the only sanction at the moment or for next year of not getting compulsory, so-called compulsory health insurance under Obamacare. And so we will get the people who sign up being the old and being the sick. And of course, therefore, premiums have to rise, and the predictions are that about 40 million people who currently have workplace health insurance in the US will probably lose that because the premiums will go up so high that their employers will not be offering it, so they'll have to go into the Obamacare exchanges if they can log onto the website. What we're seeing there is that without compulsion, if we only have the bad risks buying, then eventually the market fails, the classic Market for Lemons paper by Akerlof. Now, for a work-related contributory scheme, we see the same problem. If we run them off of payroll taxes, they will distort the choices that people who are healthy will make between working in covered and uncovered sectors. They will distort the choices that people make between working or not working at all, or indeed between working under the table for cash payments and working so as to attract the payroll tax. Now, of course, we have a very efficient taxation department and some very good economists who specialise on taxation who already do compulsion very well. And so why don't we work simply with the people who already do compulsion very well and fund these out of general revenues? How about moral hazard? And this is a strange-looking picture. This comes from my friend Eric Crampton's blog, The Offsetting Behaviour. And this is a picture from someone who should have won the Nobel Prize, Gordon Tullock. Imagine that you drove an automobile which had a spike like that pointed towards your heart, and you didn't have seatbelts. You would drive very carefully. But in fact, we don't have such automobiles. We have automobiles with seatbelts. And as a result, we don't drive as carefully as we otherwise would if we had the spike pointing at our heart. Unfortunately, there are pedestrians and other people on the road as well. And so moral hazard, you simply think of the Tullock spike, which is the banner for the Offsetting Behaviour blog of Eric Crampton. When people are somewhat insured, then they will take on inappropriate levels of risk. We see this with people building in floodplains. We see this in people where they expect a bailout will occur, then they will take on inefficient levels of risk. So in principle, contributory-based schemes, this would seem to be an argument for the motion, because this would seem to be something that a contributory-based scheme would enable people to take on suitable levels of risk and to make suitable choices. Whereas if they are not realising that their contributions through general taxation revenues are providing the benefits they draw when they claim an ACC for a bad back, well, or a bad example, another form of health care for their bad back, or for supposed unemployment. But in fact, what we see is that many of these losses tend to get socialised, right? Schemes run into trouble, schemes go bankrupt, the government steps in and socialises the losses. And so why not go the entire way and capture the scale and scope advantages of flexibly funding these through general revenues? Okay. We can think of contributory schemes as essentially a form of the earmark tax. Okay? Earmark taxes are those which have to be allocated for particular fiscal outlays. In this case, taxes coming for Social Security are spent only on Social Security. The problem with this, and earmark taxes are generally not popular, is they reduce flexibility, right? They reduce the ability of governments in their fiscal decision-making to equate at the margin, which is what we think all good economists should do. Now, the argument for the earmark, and it's an argument which was made by Gordon Tullock's co-author, James Buchanan, who did win the Nobel, is that it may limit the demands for the excessive demands for public services if people realise that they themselves are paying, and so I realise I'm paying for it rather than John Creedy over here is paying and I free ride on his tax contributions. Okay? And indeed, it may also improve tax morale because people can see a link between the tax they pay and the public services they receive. As soon as we go outside of our little volunteer fire brigade or our little New England town meeting and we allow large enough groups where free riding is very likely and possible, then this arrangement breaks down. And fundamentally, these are a second-best economic solution to what is a political problem. political leaders who lack the backbone to say we cannot afford some of these things. We cannot afford to extend people's life by 1 year at a cost of perhaps 80% of lifetime health care in that last extra year of life. We cannot afford to have cancer units in every single part of New Zealand. We cannot afford to do this and to do this, which may be somewhere else. These are ultimately political problems for which things like contributory mechanisms and earmarks are a very second-best economic solution. Okay? Along the way, it's worth pointing out that debates as to whether or not we use these as pay-as-you-go or funded really miss the point. And here I'm talking particularly of pensions rather than short-term insurance. Right? When we're young, we give up some of our claims to current production in order to have a claim on the future production when we're old. Now, unless funding raises future production because it makes the future workforce more productive or it funds some technology, then it doesn't matter whether we've accumulated a very large pool of money which then is exchanged for goods and services, because we can't eat the money, we eat the goods and services which the next generation of workers are supplying. And so the terms of that exchange depend on the productivity of those workers. Or, rather than building up financial assets, we can have promises to make a call on that future labour. In both cases, the only determinant of our living standards in old age are the productivity of the generations following us. Unless a strong case can be made for why funding is going to make those workers more productive than general taxation, and it's very unlikely, because in general taxation, things we think of as expenditures are often investments, health spending, nutrition spending, education spending, and so forth, then it's very unlikely that funding gives any particular advantage. Okay? But it brings a particular disadvantage. And here's another picture. I haven't named all the people on the pictures. I hope you can read them from the back. This is Dick Armey, who was the House Majority Leader, a Republican from Texas, under Bush, I think it was. No, under the Clinton government. 3 groups spend other people's money: children, thieves, politicians. All 3 need supervision. Okay? This from a person who was a politician. Social insurance schemes which are based on contributions entail creating a pool. Alison mentioned sometimes the pool may be sliced and diced, as in the German case where we've got 200 separate pools, or it may be one big pool, such as the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. Pools of money attract rent seekers like blood attracts sharks. Okay? Rent seekers will want to divert that pool to ends which they think they know best compared with the market. Whether this be ethical investments from the Greens, whether this be investing locally from New Zealand First and other xenophobes, or whether it be some other particular topic of the day. Right? Let's invest in green technology. Well, we've seen wonderful results from that for Obama's investment in the US. Right? Let's invest in future-proofing. Let's invest in this or that. Right? Now, of course, there's a lot of rent-seeking goes on through general tax revenues as well. But in some sense, the system of established lobby groups for spending general tax revenues between education, health, agriculture, universities, and with bulldogs like the Treasury sitting over it, is in some sense more contestable and more institutionalised than what seems to be a big pot of funds in a contributory scheme, which can be easily diverted by rent-seeking politicians or activists in general society. And so this is a very considerable risk. We see this in sovereign wealth funds, which are misspent. We see these in the private sector as well. Large pools typically attract rent-seeking. And not only is there the losses from when the pool is misdirected, but there is also all of the efforts at rent-seeking. All of those lobbyists could have been doing something much more useful, right? And so the resources, we know from rent-seeking theory that we will spend in expectation the entire amount of the rents in lobbying for those rents. And indeed, one of the things which we have done in New Zealand is to reduce these rent-seeking opportunities overall in the last 30 years. Creating dedicated pools and funds would simply open the door back to doing that again. And of course, contributory schemes will tend to increase lifetime inequality. Because if we think of purely contribution-based schemes where individuals contribute during their earnings phase and then they draw down during their decumulation phase, then shocks in the earnings phase will ripple into the overall lifetime draw from this. Okay? Gender biases are particularly exacerbated because lifetime earnings are lower for females on average than for males. Okay? And these contrast with things like New Zealand superannuation and other entitlement-based social citizenship benefits which can reduce lifetime inequality, which can reduce gender bias, and which are in many ways very female-friendly. And so this is one source of inequality, and I'll show you a picture of that right now and come back. So, apologise for having a diagram, and this situation has changed a little bit, but this is a contrast between KiwiSaver and New Zealand superannuation. And what we have down on here is the poorest part of the population all the way through to the richest part. And what we have here in the bold orange is, and this was pre-reforms made a couple of years ago, so this was around about the time of KiwiSaver being introduced and ramped up by the Cullen and Clark government. Around about 50% of the population was receiving about 10% of lifetime KiwiSaver benefits. And so 90% of lifetime KiwiSaver benefits were going to the richer 50% of the population. Anything below this 45-degree line is making inequality worse. If we put market incomes on here, they would be somewhere like that as well. What does New Zealand superannuation do? Well, because it's totally untied, and this is both its strength and Alison would argue perhaps its weakness, it's totally untied to good or bad decisions that people made prior to age 65, as long as they spent 10 years in New Zealand. It's totally untied to whether they were successful in their working life or not. It's totally untied to whether they were males or females, whether they earned a lot or earned a little. Well, it is reducing lifetime inequality because actually the poorest 40% of the population were receiving 60% of New Zealand superannuation lifetime benefits. It was making the situation more equal, and it's one of the main reasons why New Zealand has an enviably low level of old age poverty. If we relied entirely on contributory-based schemes like KiwiSaver, we would have an unenviably high level of old age poverty because bad decisions, mistakes, shocks, bad luck, and so forth, which occurred in the working life, are amplified through into old age. And that just seems to be a particularly undesirable a feature of contributory-based schemes compared with schemes which are more entitlement-based and funded out of general revenues. In addition to those more structural aspects to it, if we go towards contributory-based schemes, then the question is, well, how much responsibility do we pass to the individuals? Because we know from the work on behavioural economics that people, even economists, shockingly, do not know all details of their individual pension plans. They do not optimise them in ways in which rational actors would do so. And we know in particular that people often choose the wrong mixes of risk and reward. People are very averse to downside risks, and so they'll park their money in very safe conservative funds to avoid short-term losses, but at the time of retirement, then they will be indeed much the worse for that. Okay? And one can argue that actually, in their infinite wisdom of the benevolent dictator of government, we can do better than individuals can. And I'm surprised to ever make such a claim, but given that this is Chatham House, I'll say that. So, in conclusion, contributory schemes reduce our flexibility. They involve tying our hands in some way by creating separate pots of money when in fact we know that money is fungible. We know that if we're putting it aside here, we're not needing to spend it over there. And so the effects, the ultimate incidence of it may be quite different than where we initially see. They reduce the pooling of risk because they quarantine off some of the other activities where we could be spreading risk across early childhood education, where we could be looking at investments in unemployment versus something else, which may have a much higher rate of return to public funding. They limit the possible desirable redistribution. They are typically second best or worst because they are solutions to a political problem, which is excess demand for welfare or insufficient morale for people to fund the welfare levels which are being demanded. Both of those require politicians to deal with political problems. Those are not economic problems. And they increase lifetime inequality because shocks in the earnings phase will ripple into the decumulation phase. And indeed, as the author, or co-author, along with Grant Scobie and Trin Lee, of a paper in Feminist Economics on this very topic, I can say very strongly they increase gender biases, and we don't want to have that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Now I know why you were absolutely categorically against the offer to take the proponent perspective, so that's good. Now we have the commentator role to be played by Norman, and as I said at the beginning, he will help to open the debate up for general discussion by highlighting the main strengths and weaknesses of the alternative views and looking for a possible middle ground. Let's see whether his IQ would allow us to do that. Let's go, please, Norman. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about IQ, but I'm only bringing one brain to bear on the topic, unlike some contributors to this debate, according to Alison, so I'll give it my best shot. So, inevitably, that's the question that we're asking. Which of these two eminent scholars, numerous brains, do we believe? Let's start with the proponent. I guess a natural question I found myself asking, and I should remind you, I've seen their slides before today, or before just now, whereas they haven't seen each other's. So, is she the dodgy second-hand car saleswoman who's trying to tell us, look, these contributions are not taxes. Nobody believes they're taxes. It's fine. Just buy it. Or do we want to go with the opponent? I'm a bit dubious myself, and that's because I have a slight concern about trusting someone who himself appears to trust someone who has an uncanny resemblance to Lenin. So it is Nicholas Barr, I can attest to that, and I hadn't quite noticed this before, but as he gets older, there's something worrying about what's happening to him. You can tell me who I look like as I get older, perhaps later on. So you can start with the easy bit. There are some things that they clearly agree on that doesn't seem to be at debate at all, and that is the advantages of risk pooling from social welfare provision. So perhaps surprisingly, neither of them is arguing of get government out of social welfare because they think risk pooling is a genuine advantage and necessary. They think that government should be involved in financing it, at least as they express their views. Notice not necessarily in providing it. We might decide to delegate the fund and the financing, a lot of the financial, the fund that earns returns to some financial corporation, for example. But things like covert risk that John mentioned certainly seem to give a case. And Alison's point about we seem to have a sense of social justice that says we should help people in certain circumstances, and those circumstances are often circumstances that the market doesn't seem to cope with. So I think they're in agreement there. They might want to disagree with me in a minute. And perhaps interestingly, they both seem to recognise that this issue is kind of ambiguous on equity grounds, which perhaps comes as a bit of a surprise. We think of social welfare and social insurance as definitely progressive and pro-redistribution. John mentioned about spatial intergenerational transfers, and at the end there you saw his statistics on the inequality reducing or increasing effects of different types of welfare. Alison didn't mention, but I'm sure I read somewhere in some of the work that she's done, that about 80% of the UK national insurance system funds pensions and funds individuals' pensions. So in some sense, they're funding one's own lifetime needs for income. And so it's really not clear on horizontal equity grounds within a generation whether these things are redistributionally equity enhancing or equity reducing. And they also pretty much acknowledge that social welfare is a system, unlike other areas where we spend, perhaps, where there's an identifiable beneficiary. or return from your contributions. So it offers you income in unemployment situations. It offers you compensation. It offers you healthcare. It offers you retirement income. So it is possible to say, yeah, there's something that these contributions are buying me if we choose to go for that contributory scheme. So as I think it was John who said, or was it Alison, or was it both of them, social welfare, state-funded, does appear to be a good thing, and the real debate is around whether we should just use tax revenues more generally or go for some hypothecated tax or earmark tax, as John called it, to help fund it. So if that's the case, why do they disagree? Well, I'm just going to offer you a few thoughts and do so quickly so that you can then begin to offer your thoughts and challenge them yourselves. I think you could boil down the disagreements to fundamentally, certainly one of the fundamentals, is whether we should fund this system via tax or by what some economists would call a tax price. So social welfare contributions are the price that's perceived for welfare benefits. In that sense, you could think of it as a tax price. Or do we see social contributions as a general tax based on ability to pay? If we think that social welfare could be thought of as payment contribution for a particular benefit, then we could think of it as a tax price. It's just like any other price, or is it just like any other price? And therefore, that would suggest that it makes sense to go for a scheme of social welfare taxation that links the price that you pay in tax to the benefit you're going to receive. So I'd suggest that there are probably three questions that you should be asking, or we should be asking, in order to make a judgment between which of these two we want to believe. So the first question would be, when are contributions most likely to be perceived as a benefit principal tax, a tax price type of affair, as opposed to an ability to pay principle? And if contributions, which they are compulsory, I think they both agreed that some element of compulsion seems to be required, if they are a tax price, can the usual adverse responses that economists are always talking about to taxes, can they be ignored in that case? And then thirdly, even if the contributions are a tax, so that we don't go for a hypothecation or earmarking type of process, how damaging are these responses, with an E missing, for efficiency? So let's start with the first question, and I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. Will contributions be perceived as a benefit tax? Well, I think Alison's view seemed to be it is a myth, but if you ask the question, when is a myth not a myth, Alison's answer was, well, when it's useful for people to believe in it. So that kind of seemed fairly weak to me. That sounded to me like the tax policy principle that we're using here when we design tax policy is basically just fool as many people as you can, and if you can fool most of the people most of the time, it'll all be fine, because they'll think it's a contribution, and so it'll be a contribution. And that's the way it will behave. Well, that seems like a slightly, not a principle necessarily I'd want to follow. Will the contributions be perceived as a benefit tax? Well, I think the way to go for that is to say that it pretty much depends on how far you think social welfare contributions are used for redistribution. So the greater the redistribution that these contributions are going to try and achieve, the greater is the likelihood that it will be perceived as a tax, and the lower the likelihood that it will be perceived as a benefit-related payment. So redistribution through the social welfare system, regardless of how successful it was, they've debated whether or not it's going to achieve what it's intended to achieve, but if we try and achieve redistribution, then that will undermine the link. So the new case national insurance system, for example, is a good case in point. Alison kind of admitted that it's pretty poorly related to the benefits that you receive. So you could think of that, therefore, as perhaps potentially more likely to be seen as a tax, and therefore perhaps more likely to raise the kind of adverse responses that taxation creates. Whereas in the Netherlands or Germany or Sweden, whereas you mentioned these contributions are perhaps trying to do less redistribution, then perhaps we could expect responses to be more like a tax price. Do people treat them as a government-provided good or service? But the problem is, of course, if there's not much redistribution, then you kind of wonder whether you're going to suffer from two problems. One is it can be very expensive insurance, the point that John made about all the healthy people opt out and all the unhealthy people opt in and face expensive premiums. Or if it doesn't become expensive, then, of course, it isn't going to be much help to them because poor people are only going to be able to buy relatively small amounts of insurance and so are not going to be properly covered. So it does seem that trying to redistribute rather than have individual accounts is the most likely thing, I think, to potentially undermine the system. So what about if we did go for a contributions-based system nevertheless? Would we expect that we could avoid all these adverse problems that economists talk about, the distortion costs of raising higher taxes in order to fund public expenditure? Well, bear in mind, it still involves compulsion. So it may be contributory, there may be benefits that are identifiable, but the question arises, when it's a compulsory scheme, are there efficiency costs? Most economists say there are still efficiency costs. ACC, perhaps it's because of an element of redistribution, but I'm forced to pay 1.3, 1.7% in ACC contributions. I might prefer to do something else with that money. If the government subsidises it, then again, clearly, the moral hazard problems haven't gone away. I mean, the point that John mentioned, I think, are valid about the opting in and opting out of schemes when the government offers a large subsidy. But I think what John perhaps didn't point to, and comes more back to Alison's point, is that there may be some efficiency gains that traditional economists like John, and indeed myself, perhaps overlook too often. So one is the point that Alison, I think, was trying to make, and indeed John seemed to acknowledge, that politicians have a habit of doing things that are kind of not really sensible from an economic point of view. And one is that they tend to want to spend things that are their favourite pet projects. They want to spend more. Spending ministers always like to spend more. So by having a hypothecated tax, you actually say to ministers, no, you will not spend more money on your favourite project because this money is committed to such and such. It's committed to road building. It's committed to social welfare. It's committed to accident compensation. And in fact, one of the most right-wing economists, John mentioned him already, Buchanan worked with Gordon Tulloch. Buchanan himself argued that if governments have got some kind of monopoly power over their spending, it's quite good to make sure that when they tax you, they've got to spend it on things you want. So it's quite good to make them spend petrol duty on roads, because then they can't go and spend petrol duty on flights to San Francisco or whatever's their favourite destination at Parliament's expense. And then another reason why you might think hypothecation is a good idea is the same kind of principle, that an insurance fund for social welfare might be a way of making sure that when that unemployment spike hits us down the road, which in 2006-07 didn't seem very likely, but suddenly in 2008 seemed much more likely, it may actually be a relatively low-cost way of bearing the costs of those shocks. In other words, by planning in advance for those shocks, instead of the massive scramble that goes on when there's an emergency response, when a negative shock hits. That could be a natural disaster like Christchurch. It could be a macro disaster like global financial crisis. So maybe there are some good points that a traditional economic story tends to ignore. And then let's think about the adverse responses to taxes that people usually argue. Can they be ignored in this context? Well, interestingly, I'm having to quote the old Lenin himself, together with John Diamond. Peter Diamond is another Nobel Prize winner. We're all good at quoting our Nobel Prize winners today. So Diamond and Barr said in their analysis of pension systems, but social welfare more generally, a system that includes poverty relief will be distortionary. Minimizing distortions implies minimizing poverty relief. Distortions create second-order efficiency costs, but first-order distributional gains. Now, they've kind of nailed their colours to the mast. They've said, look, basically, you're just going to have to live with the distortions. If you want to make significant gains in redistribution, you're going to have to put up with a few, but not too big, distortionary costs. Well, I don't think that's the last word on that, because really to decide whether that statement about distortionary costs being second order and distributional gains being first order would kind of want some evidence. And interestingly, this is an area where neither of the speakers were able to provide much evidence. And I can't either, because there isn't an awful lot of evidence that we can present. Because what we'd like to know is how would people respond to hypothecated social welfare taxes? Do they behave in the way that we think taxpayers would behave? But then you even raise the question of, if we think of it as a tax, we know that some taxes are more obvious to taxpayers than others. Raj Chetty at Harvard has been doing some work recently to demonstrate that some Americans only respond to certain sales taxes and not others. But then that still raises the question, do you need to observe the tax in order to respond to it? When you see the price of goods go up in the shops, you may respond the same way regardless of whether you know it's because the tax went up or it's because prices just went up because the manufacturer raised the price. So These are quite difficult questions to answer. My kind of summary at the end would be the following that you can see up there. Be suspicious of tax myths. Don't think it's a good basis for tax policy. It's not the same as saying don't let your head rule your heart, but certainly be suspicious of a policy that's based on it. Be suspicious of hypothecated tax revenues because we just know that ministers love a guaranteed source of funding. They'll hold on to it against their cabinet colleagues at all costs, even when the spending proposals they've got to put forward are not actually that important in the grand scheme of things. On the other hand, there is a case to be made, as I think Alison was trying to make it, that indeed she did make it, that the willingness to pay may actually be helped by hypothecation. Many people might be more willing to pay income tax even if they felt that that was going to achieve certain ends that they believed in, as opposed to some government coffer that was going to do things they didn't believe in. But I'll leave you with the last point, which is in New Zealand we've got a chance to start from scratch, as Alison mentioned. So if we want to provide a better social insurance for the poor in particular, which seems to be the driving force typically for social insurance schemes, why would you, A, want to exempt capital income? You might want to raise that question yourselves. We've talked about payroll taxes as the contributory way that we fund, but payroll taxes don't tax people's capital income, they tax people's labour income. Why would we want to pretend that if there's an employer contribution that it will pay for part of the cost? We know that employers can't ultimately bear the incidence of taxes, never mind tax prices. Why would we not use a more redistributive tax, like income tax, if you want to achieve better redistribution? And then lastly, I guess the point that John had to acknowledge at the end here was, why would you want to exclude the unpaid home workers, the gender biases that seem to be a natural consequence? So that's my take. I'd be interested to hear your take.
Thank you.